Hello and welcome to the University of Nottingham. Today we're going to be considering the question, why study the Old Testament, which is a very broad question in many ways, but it's also a crucial one, first and foremost in terms of terminology. So let's start by asking, what is the Old Testament? And I'd like to introduce at this point my colleague, Dr. Doug Ingram.
In answer to your question, I think the first thing to address is why we're looking at Old Testament as opposed to Hebrew Bible. There is another of these videos which looks at why study the Hebrew Bible, and something of an answer is given in that video, but actually I would want to nuance that a little bit, because I think the answer was expressed in terms of the Old Testament for the Christian community and Hebrew Bible for others, the Jewish community and beyond. I'm not a Christian, but I still think it's important to study the Old Testament as the Old Testament, because the presumption there is that it's part of the Christian Bible and goes along with the New Testament. One of the dangers is that the Old Testament sounds old and we don't need to bother with that anymore. The New Testament sounds much more relevant because it's got new in it. But what I would want to focus on is the Old Testament as part of the Christian Bible, and I would want to argue that actually you can't really understand the New Testament without looking first at the Old Testament and seeing how the two fit together. There is another video in this series which looks at the same question. I think it's something like, why study the Old Testament in relation to the New, or something along those lines.
Yes, so the one with Margaret Barker.
Yes, yes. So that deals with these kind of issues. There are three different ways, I think three, we might come up with more, ways in which I would want to look at the Christian Bible as a whole. So one way is to consider it as a story. Now, right enough, it's a pretty complicated story. It's a story that contains quite a variety of different genre of material that is drawn from quite different periods, but there nonetheless is a storyline that runs right through. So you start at the very beginning, a very good place to start, of course, and you end at the end, not just the end of the story, but the end of everything.
The end of time, indeed.
Yeah, indeed.
Yes,
you know more about Revelation than I do. But Revelation is about the very end. So you're going from the very beginning to the very end. Now, in stories before the postmodern era, typically there was a middle around which everything revolved. Now, in terms of the Christian Bible, so we're not talking about the Hebrew Bible, we're not even talking about the Old Testament, but about the Christian Bible as a whole, including the Old Testament, Jesus is that centre. So Jesus' birth, life, death and resurrection are the centre around which the Christian Bible as a story revolves. So there's a sense in which, again I emphasise for the Christian Bible, that the Old Testament leads up to this centre, and then the New Testament explores some of the implications of that centre, drawing on themes from the Old Testament. So what now is the relevance of the kind of things that we've looked at in the Old Testament in light of Jesus' birth, life, death and resurrection? One of the advantages of talking about the Hebrew Bible is that you deal with what we might call the Old Testament, although an important point is that they're not even identical in terms of the books they contain or the order of those books.
What we would call the canon.
Indeed, yeah. But one advantage of looking at the Hebrew Bible is that it helps you to focus on those books in their own right. So rather than going to them with presumptions about Christianity, about Jesus, about the New Testament era, you look at them in their own right against their own historical background and try to work out what they might have been saying to ancient communities before Jesus' time. And I think actually if we're going to understand the Old Testament and how it relates to the New Testament, it's crucial that we understand it in its own terms as well. So we looked first at the Christian Bible as a story. The second thing that relates to that point is that it's actually a library of very diverse literature. So you've got genres of all types. You've got history-like literature, you've got legal-like material, you've got poetry, you've got songs, you've got short stories, you've got very extended stories, you've got material that comes from a very ancient period, There's some debate about the dating of this material, but at least several hundred, if not many hundred years before Christ, through of course to the New Testament material, which was probably completed sometime in the 1st or just into the 2nd century AD.
And indeed this is where we get the term Bible. It is a books, it is a collection of books, a library. Indeed. Of course, yeah.
So an important aspect about what is the Old Testament is that it's lots of different things, and whatever you're looking for in terms of types of literature, there'll be something in there that piques your interest. If you happen to be the kind of person who likes reading through legal material, well, go and have a look at Leviticus. Most people are not quite so keen on that kind of material.
It wouldn't be a classic place to start.
No, it wouldn't be a classic place to start. But there are lots of stories that people can relate to. So there are short stories like the story of Jonah, like the story of Ruth. And there are stories contained within larger stories. So you get the story of creation, the effectively first chapter of Genesis that tells you that story from one perspective. And then in the second the second and third chapters, you get a very different story about creation. And there are lots of fascinating stories embedded in longer stories as well. So a huge variety of different kinds of material. So that would be a second way to look at it.
And also this is definitely approaching the question, why study it? This is such a rich array of books and different types of genres that you've described to us. It sounds exciting. Old Testament study sounds exciting.
It is exciting. And one of the exciting aspects of the fact that it is such a diverse library of different kinds of material is that you need to employ all sorts of different tools in order to study it. So when it comes to why studying the Old Testament, well, one reason is because it is fascinating literature. Some of it's very hard going, some of it actually is a great joy to read. Not that the hard going stuff can't be a great joy, because it can as well. Often requires more work.
Yeah.
But because of the diversity of kind of material that it is, you need to look at it in different ways. So for example, if we're looking at historical material, it makes sense to look at what the historical background is against which it's set. So we might employ such things as archaeology, we might employ such things as sociology in order to understand that material as best we can. We've talked about short and longer stories. We can look at the Old Testament employing the tools of textual criticism. We can look at it as literature and employ all the kind of literary tools, narratological tools in order to understand that material as best we can. There are all sorts of ways in which we can draw on a variety of different disciplines in order to understand the Old Testament.
Doug, in a way this is a good place to end. You've given us a tantalising glimpse of what the Old Testament is, and also what we might do now to go away and begin that process of studying the Old Testament. So Doug, thank you very much.
Thank you.